Welcome to this, the first in a series of videos about Mark's Gospel. I first started looking at Mark about 11 years ago, and I've been coming back to Mark ever since. I found the Gospel utterly fascinating and quite distinctive, not only in its message, but in the way it's delivered. So I want to explore it now as we approach Year B in the lectionary and Mark sets the theme for the year, but also in this time when there is so much uncertainty. It seems a particularly appropriate message. So, in this video, I want to start briefly by looking at precisely what we consider Mark to be. In particular, does Mark end at chapter 16, verse 8? Or should we include one of the optional endings which appear in most Bibles, the shorter or the longer ending? Or perhaps anticipate that there's another ending that we have lost and know nothing of? The second thing I want to do is to just look at some of the challenges that we face as we go through and look at Mark. Mark, being distinctive, does raise its own issues. Finally, I'll think about where we go in the next video. So, does Mark end at chapter 16 verse 8 with trembling and bewildered? The women went out from the tomb and fled. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. R.T. France says that is a paradox too far. We've had all sorts of calamities happening. The disciples have fled. Peter has betrayed Jesus. Jesus' last words are, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And now even the women, famously the most faithful of all the disciples, have deserted and fled. It's a paradox too far for R.T. France. This is not good news. This is not how a gospel ends. There must be something else. In the other camp, we've got somebody like John Fenton. He was the first person that I came across who articulated this view. Essentially, Mark's painted himself into a hole. How could any ending follow, in his words, without hiatus, contradiction, or redundancy? Put it this way. Did the women change their mind and go and tell the disciples? Well, actually, Mark doesn't say they decided not to tell anybody. He says they didn't. So that would be a contradiction. On the other hand, let's say Jesus just appeared to the other disciples, presumably in Galilee. Well, then what's the point of the young man in the tomb? His message was ignored. And what's the point in the women? They didn't do anything. The conclusion I came to was that we have to start with John Fenton, because that is actually the gospel. This is the tangible evidence that we have. On the other hand, we can't ignore the arguments of people like R.T. France, because they have an absolute point. How is this good news? So I want to postpone further consideration of this point until we've had a chance to look at the rest of the gospel, learn about Mark's message, and think, can this possibly be good news? Can there be real hope in the gospel like this? So, the second point are the challenges of working with Mark. The first is Matthew and Luke. Mark is known as almost certainly the first of the synoptic gospels to be written. Matthew and Luke add their little bits and tweak slightly from time to time. More Luke than Matthew, it has to be said, but basically they're adding material. And as they do, they change the emphasis. Now herein is the rub. They add resurrection appearances. And so we kind of assume that Mark should have resurrection appearances. But more subtly, at the beginning of the Gospel, for example, when Jesus goes into the desert to be tempted, in Matthew and Luke we have the temptations. Jesus encounters the devil. He's taken up onto the pinnacle of the temple and tempted to throw himself down. He sees he sees stones and is tempted to turn them into loaves of bread. Who wouldn't be? And he's finally tempted to worship the devil, to worship Satan instead of God. The difficulty is that when we read Mark, we remember that. But they're not in Mark. And when we look at that passage in more detail, I'll be arguing that Mark has a very different perspective and very different emphasis, and uses this passage, this time in Jesus' life, to give a very different message. So, we need to forget Matthew and Luke as we study Mark, and that is not easy. The second thing again relates to Matthew and Luke. They both have stories which exemplify their message. I think probably the most obvious is in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew. How many times does Jesus says, "You have heard it said, but I say to you"? Ego de lego. I remember a New Testament lecturer going on about ego de lego, a catchphrase. So the thing is that Mark doesn't work like that. You can't take individual stories from Mark and say, oh, this is typical Mark. This is an example of Mark's message. Because Mark builds his message not into individual stories but into the structure. Possibly the best known example of that are the healing of the blind people. You get the blind man who comes to Jesus and is healed. But then he sees people walking round like trees. That's in chapter 8. Towards the end of chapter 10, we get Bartimaeus. He sees instantly. And what does he do? He follows Jesus on the road. And Jesus is heading to Jerusalem. Now in between, we get lots of stories about misunderstanding. Classically, Peter, yes, you're the Messiah, but no, you mustn't suffer. So there's a structure, and without the structure we lose Mark's message. What I want to do in the next video is to look at two of these pairs in particular, because not only are they pairs and not only did they develop, but they're interlaced, and that's the storms and the feeding of the crowds. So structure matters in Mark, and the problem is that our lectionary deals in individual stories. What's more, it says, hang on, we've had one feeding, let's only have one, we don't need the other one as well. But without both, we lose them, we lose the message. So we've got to bear that in mind when we're preaching on Mark. Now, this is perhaps getting a bit controversial, and I hope I don't offend anybody. But Mark's described as an action gospel by so many people. And I don't think it is. I'm tempted to say to somebody who believes it's an action gospel, did you ever get to the end? Put it this way. R.T. France uses that common example of Mark's dynamism, the word euthos, immediately. 11 times he uses it in the first chapter of Mark. It drives the narrative forward. Do you know what? He goes on to say that he uses this word 37 times in his gospel. Now, if you stop for just half a minute, something ought to strike you. Mark has used up a quarter of his ration of euthos in the first chapter. And if euthos is driving the narrative forward, there is less and less to drive the narrative forward as we go through the gospel. Yes, it does start at a rip-roaring pace, but it certainly doesn't keep it up. So, for example, as we start chapter 11, and on Palm Sunday, the final week of Jesus' life, we're only two-thirds the way through the gospel. We've got a third to go. And this dynamic, miracle-working Jesus is going to do one miracle. Now, I'm a lousy gardener. I'm not impressed by people who kill things. But Jesus' miracle is to kill a fig tree. It's not exactly the dynamic, action-packed gospel. For sure, the tension rises. Mark is a genius dramatist and writer of narrative. But even more, Jesus is arrested, and in 1453 he's taken to the Sanhedrin. And from this point onwards, this dynamic Jesus is the subject of only 9 verbs. 4 of them are negative. He said nothing to anyone, or he was silent. The first, he is standing before the Sanhedrin and he is asked, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One?" "I am," says Jesus. Jesus using that divine name, ego eimi. "I am," says Jesus. "And you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of God and coming on the clouds of heaven." Now that is dramatic, but it's also the words that get Jesus arrested, finally convicted. They don't need any more evidence. He's done it all himself. Next time Jesus speaks, it's answering Pilate, "Are you the King of the Jews?" Again, Jesus confesses, but this time in a more sort of offhand way. "So you say." The third verb is Jesus crying from the cross. "Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani." My God, why have you forsaken me?" The final 2 are Jesus gave a loud cry and he died. The gospel draws to a halt. I have that feeling of the emptiness of the Saturday. And it's there in Mark, albeit that there is nothing to say, no words to express it. The gospel comes to a close, to a standstill, and then peters out, right up to those words. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. Not an action gospel. Certainly dramatic. There's a great narrative arc, and within that is the message, and we need to explore it. And just to stir things up again, Mark as the first gospel. Well, it's the first of the 4, almost certainly. Certainly, I'm absolutely convinced that Mark is the source for Matthew and Luke. But the first gospel to be written? Now, Mark is written in the mid-60s, mid-late 60s perhaps. And for 30 years, the church has been growing, attracting all sorts of people, intellectuals, workers, the whole range of society. It just seems to me utterly incredible that at no point in those 30 years somebody hasn't put pen to paper to record the life, works, teaching, miracles of Jesus. Of course they did. The fact that we don't have them is evidence of nothing. But this is really quite important in our understanding of Mark. If Mark were to be the first gospel ever to be written, then there's a responsibility on Mark to make sure all the facts are there. But if Mark is writing in the context of lots of other writing, and that it's well known and well accredited, the life and works of Jesus, Mark is actually concerned with getting over his distinctive message. Now I think that's important, because Mark's message is distinctive. And as we go through, we realise he assumes the resurrection. So when he doesn't give it, there is purpose. Now I'll be arguing that Mark stops before appearances so that we stay with that moment. That Saturday sense, that emptiness, that utter loss. Those words ringing in our ears, my God, why have you forsaken me? And to jump ahead, because we all like to know how the story ends, I'll be arguing that Mark is written as a pastoral theology precisely for people who are crying out, my God, why have you forsaken me? We'll get to that at the end. But that's just a glimpse of where I believe we go as we explore Mark. So as I say, in the next video I'm planning to explore what Mark is doing through his repetitions, particularly of the storms and the feeding of the crowds. So thanks for sticking with me this far, and I hope you'll continue. So bye for now, God bless,